The process begins in September 1918, Boston, Massachusetts. The city is a portrait of industrial muscle and wartime anxiety. From the docks of the harbor, the salt spray mixes with the thick, black coal smoke of the departing troop ships. Men are being fed into the furnace of the Western Front, but as the sun sets over the Atlantic, a different kind of passenger is arriving. It has no rank, no uniform, and no mercy. Inside the Chelsea Naval Hospital, the air does not move. It sits heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sour, rhythmic wheeze of lungs that have forgotten how to breathe. These are the survivors, men who crawled through the mud of the Meuse Argonne, who dodged German lead and the suffocating clouds of mustard gas, only to come home to this, a bed in a dim ward, where the enemy is invisible and the silence is a death sentence. The hospital is a monument to modern order. White tiles, scrubbed floors, and windows bolted shut against the evil humors of the Massachusetts autumn. The medical establishment is paralyzed. They cling to the leather-bound manuals of the 19th century, clutching their stethoscopes like talismans against a demon they do not understand. They call it the Spanish Lady, but there is no grace in her touch. As the sun dips below the horizon, the ward takes on a ghostly glow. The nurses move like shadows between the rows of cots. They are the invisible agents, the daughters and sisters who were told their role was to comfort, not to question. But as they move, they notice something the doctors, in their hurried rounds, have missed. They notice the black box of the indoor ward. When a patient is brought into the enclosed room, the air is treated as a static container. The medical manual dictates that the heat must be preserved to fight the fever. But this action, this input, triggers a mechanical betrayal. Inside the stagnant air, the viral particles do not settle. They drift. They linger in the warm, humid corners of the ceiling, concentrating like a toxic mist. Instead of a sanctuary, the ward becomes a recirculating chamber of death. One cough, one labored exhale, and the virus is delivered directly into the lungs of the man in the next bed. It is a fatal flaw of architecture. A system designed for protection has become a mechanism for mass infection. The results are immediate and brutal. The mortality rate begins its climb. 10%, 20%, soon nearly 40% of the men who enter these doors. Do not leave them. The chief surgeon, a man named Dr. Henderson, walks the halls with a face of stone. He is the personification of the system. To him, the mounting body count is a tactical reality, a price to be paid to the invisible enemy. During a morning round, a young nurse, Elizabeth, dares to pause at his side. "The air, doctor," she whispers, her voice trembling but steady. "It's stagnant. The men, they're drowning in each other's breath. If we could just open the casements, let the breeze through." Henderson doesn't even look at her. He adjusts his spectacles, the glass reflecting the dim, flickering light of the hallway. "The manual is quite clear, nurse. Exposure to the damp night air is a catalyst for pneumonia. We do not deviate from the established protocol because of a feeling. Our duty is to maintain the environment, not to surrender it to the elements." In that moment, the arrogance of the establishment is audible. It is the crystallized hubris of a system that prioritizes the manual over the human. They claimed that the disaster was unavoidable because the procedure was being followed. But while Henderson retires to his office to update his charts, Elizabeth remains in the dark. She watches a young sailor, barely 18, struggle for air. His face is turning a haunting shade of blue, the heliotrope cyanosis that signals the end. He is drowning on dry land, and the very walls meant to protect him are the ones pressing the water into his lungs. The silence of the ward is not peaceful. It is the hush of a vacuum. But outside, beyond the brick and the glass, the wind is howling across the harbor. The sun is preparing to rise over the Atlantic. And in the quiet corners of the hospital, a radical, desperate thought is beginning to take root in the minds of the nurses. They are looking at the empty tents in the supply yard. They are looking at the vast, open sky. And they are beginning to realize that if the building is a tomb, then the only hope for life lies in the wild, untamed air of the outside. The system is failing. The doctors are retreating into their theories. But the ghost in the machine is stirring. While the establishment screams in a panic of rising numbers and overflowing morgues, Elizabeth and her sisters are already in the dark, holding the silence that will soon lead them to the greatest gamble in medical history. They are about to commit an act of professional treason. They are about to take the dying and throw them to the wind. But for now, the ward remains still. The only sound is the ticking of the clock on the wall and the slow, wet rasp of 100 men exhaling their last breaths into a room that has run out of life. The doctors believe they have the situation under control. They believe the walls are their fortress, but they have fatally underestimated their opponent. The virus does not care for walls. And the nurses, the ones they dismissed as just orderlies, are about to show them that sometimes the only way to save the system is to tear it down. Make of the process shifts from the stagnant dark to the blinding gray of a Massachusetts morning. The sound begins as a rhythmic scraping, metal legs dragging across stone. Then the crunch of gravel. In the early hours of October, while the city of Boston is still draped in a funeral shroud of coal smoke, a radical mutiny is taking place. Led by a few defiant nurses and a surgeon who has decided that the established wisdom is merely a slower way to die, they are moving the beds. They aren't moving them to another ward or a better wing. They are dragging the dying out of the hospital entirely. One by one, the survivors of the Western Front are wheeled through the heavy oak doors and into the biting, salt-cracked air of the Atlantic coast. They are being taken to a place called Camp Brooks. It isn't a hospital, it is an open field, a stretch of grass and dirt where the only ceiling is the vast, uncaring sky. Imagine the scene. A soldier, his lungs heavy with the fluid of the Spanish lady, feels the first touch of the autumn wind. To the medical boards in Washington, this is madness. It is a death sentence. They believe that exposing a feverish man to a 50-degree breeze is tantamount to murder. They see the cold as a predator, but the nurses see the fatal flaw of the indoors. Think of the indoor ward like a stagnant pond, where the water never moves and the rot just deepens. The mechanism of death here is simple. In a closed room, the viral load, the concentration of the invisible enemy, reaches a tipping point. The air becomes a saturated sponge of infection. By moving the patients outside, the nurses have triggered a natural dilution. In the open air, the viral particles do not hover. They are snatched away by the wind like smoke from a dying fire. And then there is the sun. Even in the pale light of October, the sun provides a silent, invisible executioner for the virus. The ultraviolet radiation acts like a microscopic scythe, shredding the outer casing of the pathogen on every surface, the blankets, the pillows, the very skin of the men. It is the freaking fresh air factor. But the transition is not a miracle. It is a grueling, freezing struggle. The yes but technique of history is in full effect here. Yes, the air is cleaner. But the nurses are now fighting the elements. Every solution creates a new crisis. The wind that clears the virus also threatens to steal the heat from a man's failing heart. Elizabeth and her sisters do not sleep. They wrap the men in layers of heavy wool, tucking hot water bottles made of stone at their feet. They build makeshift windbreaks out of canvas and hope. When the rain comes, they stand in the mud, holding tarps over the beds, their own hands turning white and numb. They are the invisible agents fighting a war on two fronts, the virus in the lungs and the cold on the skin. During the second week at Camp Brooks, a representative from the Naval Medical Board arrives. He is the personification of the system, a man in a crisp, pressed uniform who hasn't touched a patient in years. He stands at the edge of the field, his boots polished to a mirror shine, looking at the rows of tents with a sneer of pure, crystallized arrogance. "This is a circus, not a clinic," he remarks to the head nurse. "You are treating these men like cattle in a pasture. You have abandoned the hygiene of the ward for the filth of the earth. When the first frost hits, their blood will stop in their veins, and the responsibility will be yours alone. The manual exists for a reason, nurse. You are playing God with the wind." He treats the fresh air as a lack of discipline. He believes the system of the indoors is the only thing standing between civilization and the dark. But he has missed the terrifying reality that the boss, nature itself, is already delivering its verdict. While he stands there, safe in his certainty, the charts are beginning to speak a truth that the medical boards cannot ignore. Inside the brick-and-mortar hospitals of Boston, the black box of the indoor ward is still producing its grim output: 40% mortality. 4 out of every 10 men are being carried out in pine boxes. But here, in the mud, under the canvas, in the wind that the colonel calls filth, the laughter of the Spanish lady is fading. The mortality rate at Camp Brooks hasn't just dropped, it has cratered from 40% to 13%. It is a statistical impossibility. A victory won not with new drugs or complex machinery, but with the intuitive genius of moving a bed 500 yards into the sun. Yet, the struggle is far from over. The yes, but continues. As the success of Camp Brooks becomes a whispered legend among the soldiers, the demand for space explodes. They are dragging more beds into the field, more men into the cold. The nurses are collapsing from exhaustion, their own lungs beginning to burn with the effort of breathing the very air they are using to save others. The system is watching. And the system does not like to be proven wrong by a group of women in a muddy field. The authorities begin to tighten the noose. They claim the open air method is a temporary fluke. They argue that the logistics of a tent city are unsustainable as winter approaches. They are looking for any excuse to pull the men back into the safety of the airless wards. They believe their creation is too big to fail, too established to be replaced by the sky. But the ocean respects no rank, and the Massachusetts winter is coming. While the directors toast their ordered hospitals in the city, a new storm is brewing on the horizon, a storm that will test whether the fresh air factor is a fluke of history, or the only thing that can save the world from itself. The nurses stand their ground. They look at the blue tint fading from the sailors' faces. They see the eureka moment in the eyes of men who, for the first time in weeks, can take a breath without feeling the walls closing in. They know the truth. They know that the building is the enemy. But the impending doom isn't just the virus. It is the pride of the men who built the walls. And as the first snowflakes begin to mingle with the salt spray of the Atlantic, the nurses realize that the hardest part of the battle isn't fighting the disease. It's fighting the people who would rather see the men die by the manual than live by the sun. The winter of 1918 arrives not with a whisper, but with a glacial howl. As the calendar turns toward December, the open-air experiment at Camp Brooks reaches its visceral peak. The nurses are no longer just caregivers. They have become sentinels of the sun. The scene is surreal. Rows of white beds, stark against the gray Massachusetts slush, filled with men breathing air that should, by all accounts of the era's medical logic, be killing them. But the time freeze case of history shows us a different reality. Look closely at the hands of the soldiers. They are no longer the blue of a drowning man. They are the flushed pink of a body fighting back. The technical black box of this survival is hidden in the physics of light. The sun's ultraviolet rays, specifically UVB, act like a silent microscopic fire. While the cold air keeps the lungs from being reinfected by stagnant droplets, the radiation from the sky is dismantling the very protein shell of the virus. It is a dual-layered defense that no indoor ward, no matter how scrubbed or bleached, could ever replicate. The establishment is forced into a humiliating silence. The mortality rates are undeniable. In the city, the hospitals are overflowing morgues. At Camp Brooks, the men are asking for second helpings of soup. But then, the Spanish lady begins to retreat. By the spring of 1919, the fever that broke the world starts to dissipate. The emergency is declared over, and it is here, in the quiet aftermath, that the bitter aftertaste begins to coat the tongue of history. The process of erasure starts in the marble halls of Washington, D.C. The war is won. The victory parades march down Pennsylvania Avenue. But if you look for Elizabeth, or the dozens of nurses who stood in the freezing mud to prove the sky could heal, you will find nothing. They are not on the podiums. They are not mentioned in the official naval reports on the pandemic's end. The system has a very short memory for solutions it didn't invent. As the tents are folded and the gravel is swept away, the medical establishment undergoes a recalibration of hubris. They don't want to remember the mud. They don't want to remember that their billion-dollar hospitals were death traps. They want to move forward into the era of the machine, of the laboratory, of the controlled environment. The nurses are sent back to the shadows of the low ranking. Their intuitive genius is reclassified as temporary luck or battlefield necessity. The crystallized arrogance of the 1920s takes over. The manual is rewritten, not to include the fresh air factor, but to emphasize the power of the new pharmaceutical age. We began to build higher, tighter, more enclosed. We traded the healing power of the world outside for the convenience of the thermostat. We are left with a haunting paradox. We have more medicine than any generation in human history. Yet we spend 90% of our lives in the same stagnant air that killed the sailors in the Chelsea Naval Hospital. Why did we so easily discard the simplest, most potent weapon we ever possessed against the dark? The answer is a mirror reflecting our own modern hubris. We believe that we have conquered nature rather than realizing we are a part of it. We trust the air conditioner more than the breeze. We trust the ceiling more than the sun. We have built a world of sealed safety, forgetting that a room without breath is just a grave with a higher price tag. Do we see this same arrogance in our society today? Every time we prioritize a protocol over a human truth, every time we ignore the warning of the underdog because they lack the proper rank. We are back in that stagnant ward in 1918. The healing power of the outside wasn't lost because it failed. It was lost because it was free. It couldn't be patented. It couldn't be bottled. And in a world that values the system over the spirit, the simplest truths are often the first to be buried in the dust of time. If you believe that stories like Elizabeth's and the forgotten nurses of Camp Brooks deserve to be remembered, please like and subscribe. To help us uncover the rest of the story, your support keeps these voices from fading. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.